When Jonathan found a very weak-looking black puppy in the middle of the woods, his first instinct was to take him to a local vet for help. But he soon realized that it was a big mistake. It was not a puppy, and he should have left it where he found it, but it was too late for that. The vet's reaction had made Jonathan even more sure of his suspicions. He hadn't rescued a puppy from the woods. This was something very different, and the repercussions were serious. But what kind of animal had Jonathan rescued from the forest? And why would it have been better for him to leave it there alone? Welcome to Wonderbot Animals. Jonathan has been an animal lover for as long as he could remember. Today would not be the first time he had embarked on a rescue mission for an animal in need. Jonathan thought he had seen it all. After all, he had rescued dozens of animals, from birds to rodents, lost dogs and cats, and something resembling a wild boar. He didn't like being called a hero, but deep down he felt good helping these animals. After all, they were so cute and adorable. How could he refuse to help an animal in need? He was quite skilled at helping animals, he could identify basic problems and knew some vets in town. This also meant that he felt quite confident in his abilities to identify animals, but this time would be different. The biggest problem was the baby animal being alone, but problems would arise soon. While taking one of his walks through the woods outside the city, Jonathan was sure he heard an animal calling for help. He stopped in the forest, waiting to hear it again. It was only a few seconds before he heard the scream again. Jonathan was determined to find the lost puppy. Listening to the screams and taking soft, careful steps, he made his way through the forest. Scared that he might have gone too far, Jonathan took a few steps back until he heard the soft crying again. That's when he saw the little thing. There was a small bed of moss, and on it was a small black puppy, so young that his eyes had not yet fully opened. Jonathan leaned over the poor creature and looked around for other potential pups. Jonathan spent a few minutes observing the small creature, trying to see if it had any injuries of any kind. The puppy seemed fine, except that he was alone and probably scared. The small bed of moss holding the supposed pup seemed strange to Jonathan. It was not something usually naturally found in nature. Maybe some animal had built it as a kind of nest. If it hadn't been an animal and it wasn't natural, that left one possibility: humans. The big question was, why would someone go out into the middle of the woods and leave a puppy alone? And was it even a puppy? Making a makeshift carrier for the small animal from the cover of his travel bag, he carefully placed the puppy inside it. He still had a ways to go before reaching his car, but at least for now, the little pup would be safe and protected from any nasty animals in the surrounding area. Jonathan repeatedly checked on the puppy as he walked back to his car. It was threatening to rain, and Jonathan didn't want the little one to get wet or cold. But the more he looked at the animal, the more curious he became. Although he at first suspected that he was not a puppy, he was now almost certain. The black creature was small and definitely a baby, so it didn't have any distinguishing features. It was too young to know what it was, but the face looked quite strange. It wasn't until later in their walk that Jonathan had another idea. Perhaps the animal was not native to this forest or area. A puppy wouldn't be native to here, but at least it would make a little more sense. It didn't really matter what the creature was. Jonathan was going to take care of it and get it the help it needed. A shelter would probably accept the puppy, but he had to be seen by a veterinarian first. The city was half an hour away by car. After a few more minutes, Jonathan finally arrived back at the parking lot. It didn't take him more than 2 seconds to realize that something was very, very wrong. The parking lot was completely empty. There was no one. Before we continue with this story, like this video to help it reach 12K likes, share and subscribe to our channel. Recovering, Jonathan headed to the spot where he was sure he had parked his car. Thinking he might be wrong, he took a quick walk through the parking lot and looked for it. He could not have been towed. Crouching down to the pavement, Jonathan found a pile of broken glass, little bits he had overlooked before. It was now evident that someone had broken into his car and stolen it. They had had the time and the opportunity. The park he had walked through was not well known and was on a fairly quiet road. Luckily for him, Jonathan still has his phone and some battery. He decided to first call the police to report the theft of his car. Jonathan told police what type of car he had, the make, model, where it had been, the license plate, and anything else that seemed important to him. The police told him they would keep an eye out for him, but that was all they could do for now. He thought about getting to his apartment in the city, but the little creature in his pack still needed attention. He needed to get to the vet first and then go home. Unfortunately, the vet's office was in town, still half an hour away, and now he didn't even have a car. Jonathan checked the Uber app first. No one was willing to drive that far out of town to pick him up. Jonathan was willing to pay the price of a trip, but no one was interested. Next, Jonathan tried a taxi service. He explained his situation to them, but they also said no. The person on the phone was worried it was a scam to steal from them and their drivers. This didn't stop Jonathan, though. In such a big city, there were several taxi companies, but he lost hope when one service after another rejected him. He decided to hitchhike. Although there weren't many cars passing by on this road, eventually one would have to come. It was only a matter of time. Luckily for him, he only had to wait about 10 minutes before a car approached the bend. Jonathan flagged down the car, and once he had their attention, he stuck out his thumb, showing that he needed a ride. A middle-aged woman rolled down the window of her car. Jonathan explained what had happened to him. As luck would have it, she was also heading to the city and had no problem picking up Jonathan to accompany her along the way. She seemed kind enough and believed his story. Jonathan sat, his mind on the animal he cradled in his arms. Beside him, the woman's Labrador approached the bundle, sniffing slowly to find out what was hidden inside it. At first, Jonathan thought that the dog had smelled a puppy and that her maternal instinct had kicked in, but he quickly realized how wrong he was. Jonathan smiled at the larger dog, loosening his grip on the bundle covering the puppy and allowing the Labrador to approach the bundle. The Labrador was calm, leading Jonathan to believe that the larger dog would not pose a threat. Jonathan only realized his mistake when it was too late. The Labrador looked at the puppy and sniffed at the small animal for a second, before becoming alarmingly aggressive. The Lab began growling with her teeth bared, before her owner quickly reprimanded her for her behavior. Jonathan stared in horror, before turning away from the larger dog, who was still visibly upset by the puppy's presence. Jonathan sighed in frustration. It was becoming very clear that the animal he had picked up in the forest was definitely not a puppy. Jonathan closed his eyes as he silently waited for a veterinarian to clarify the situation. Nodding his head, he stared determinedly, changing his plans. He would go to the vet first. It was now clear that finding out the identity of the animal would have to be a priority. Shortly afterwards, they arrived at the vet's office. The lady wished him luck and left him in front of the building. After checking in at the front desk, Jonathan sat in the waiting room, keeping the little creature curled up in the bundle to avoid agitating the other animals in the office. The receptionist informed Jonathan that she would put him on the list because the animal seemed to be in very bad condition and she did not want its presence to bother the other animals. Even with that information, Jonathan was surprised when he heard his name called out just a few minutes later. Jonathan had the animal in his hand and the vet directed him to a chair. He narrated the events that occurred in the forest to the veterinarian, who listened attentively and took notes. Now that the little animal was in the vet's care, Jonathan could focus on other important matters. Firstly, the theft of his car. Jonathan called the police to report his car stolen and learned that he would have to be moved to another department. Fortunately, they had found his car. The thief had apparently arrived in town with a broken window, and a police officer spotted the vehicle and stopped it for a routine check. When the driver couldn't provide his details, the thief and the car were detained, and Jonathan had called moments later. Jonathan was surprised to hear all this information, but he was glad that things had turned out well on that end. He still had to fill out some paperwork to get the car delivered, not to mention sort out his insurance. But before he had the chance, he felt someone tap him on the shoulder frantically. It was the vet. Jonathan apologized to the police officers and hung up. He was a little confused by the intense look the vet had on his face, but soon his curiosity would be satisfied. "I know it's not your fault, but you made a big mistake by bringing this animal here." Jonathan felt his heart sink. Jonathan's defeated look grew even deeper as the doctor explained what was happening. It turned out that the young animal was indeed in a serious situation, and there was nothing the doctor could do for him now that the disease had progressed. However, that wasn't the worst of it. In its current state, the animal posed a great danger to the other animals in the clinic. The doctor explained that the animal was infected by a virus that was incredibly contagious for smaller mammals. Not only was it highly contagious, but it was also a nearly fatal infection when not detected in time, which was the case with the baby raccoon Jonathan had found. Jonathan's eyes widened in surprise. A raccoon? He almost laughed at the situation. His suspicions had been correct and, in fact, it was not a puppy. But the truth was that he would never have imagined that the little animal was a raccoon. The virus the raccoon was infected with was well known to the veterinarian who had been studying it for the past few weeks. It had recently been widely reported in the area and was more common among raccoons, rabbits, guinea pigs, hamsters, etc. Jonathan was confused. What had he done? The doctor quickly calmed him down, explaining that they had already isolated the raccoon in the back of the store. However, both the vet and Jonathan would need a new set of clothes and a shower to prevent spreading the virus to other animals. Luckily for Jonathan and the clinic staff, there was no risk of contracting the virus, as humans were immune to it. This made Jonathan feel much better, but the doctor explained that even after the shower, the protocol was that the other animals would have to be examined to check their safety. A few hours later, all the tests were done. The vet came out again and announced that all the animals had tested negative. Unfortunately, the baby raccoon's situation only worsened as time went by, and he died shortly after. That day was strange and eventful, and Jonathan still thinks about it often. In retrospect, it was clear that he should have left the baby raccoon in the woods. But at that moment, abandoning a baby animal had not seemed like the most appropriate thing to do. And even now, he was glad he had made the decision to try to save it. After all, doing everything he could to help those in need was part of what made him who he was. Have you ever tried to save a stranded animal? Do you still have a rescued animal living with you? Tell us about it in the comments and remember to like, subscribe and ring the notification bell for more stories like this. See you in the next video.